So it's now a great pleasure to introduce Marina Rustow, who is the Kadori A. Zilka Professor of Jewish Civilization in the Near East and Professor of Near Eastern Studies and History at Princeton University. She is the author of numerous articles, I'm not going to mention all of them, and also the book entitled Heresy and the Politics of Community, The Jews of the Fatimid Caliphate, that appeared with Cornell University Press in 2008. The recipient of a MacArthur Fellowship, Professor Rustow is currently writing a book that focuses on the study of Judeo-Arabic documents found in the Cairo Geniza. She will be also giving a lecture for those of you, and I'm sure you'll all be interested, tomorrow evening on campus, which is in partnership with the Center for Medieval Studies. The talk will be entitled Archives, Paper, and the State Under the Fatimids, and it is at 7 o'clock tomorrow in Anderson Library, room 120. It promises also to be a wonderful talk. Professor Rustow's talk tonight is entitled Medieval Jews and the Cairo Geniza in the Digital Age. Please join me in welcoming Marina Rustow.
Thank you so much for that very warm introduction. I'm a medievalist, which means that I study the period between 500 and 1500. I have a colleague who says Rustow doesn't go out past 1500 unaccompanied. That's more or less true. And one of the problems that pre-modern historians all face is lack of information. But it turns out that Old Cairo, or Fustat, as its inhabitants called it, is the medieval city about which we know more than any other. Fustat was the residential core of what's now Cairo, and the city of Cairo itself was founded in 973 as a Palatine compound. So it was off limits to anyone who wasn't actually a part of the Fatimid dynasty, who I'll be telling you about in a bit. The reason we know so much about this city, which eventually merged and kind of amalgamated into a single city by about 1250, is because of the Cairo Geniza, which is the largest single cache of documents from the Middle East before the Ottoman conquest in 1517. So the Ottomans were very good at archiving, and the Ottoman archives in Istanbul contain enough information for generations and generations of historians. So the Ottomans have enormous archives, and the going word about the Middle East before the Ottoman period has been for a couple of generations of scholarship that there's nothing comparable from before the Ottoman period. But it turns out things are a bit more complicated than that. The study of the Geniza began in the late 19th century, and it's, I think, no exaggeration to say that it's transformed the study of medieval Jewish history. But there's also plenty of information in the Geniza about Christians and Muslims as well. In many cases, it's information that can't be extracted from other sources. It's the degree to which the find of the Geniza is fortunate. It kind of works from a number of different perspectives. Jews in the Islamic world were an estimated 90% of Jews worldwide in the period that I study, which is the 9th through 12th centuries. So if you wanted to find anything about Jews in that period, Cairo was a pretty good place to find it. A Geniza in Ashkenaz wouldn't have given us nearly as much information about world Jewry. And the geographic reach of this particular community of Jews was absolutely staggering, something I'll get back to in a minute. So just to give you a kind of fact sheet about the Geniza, the cache is from a single synagogue. If you go to Fustat, which nowadays is called Coptic Cairo because there are a lot of medieval Christian churches there, and you go down this alley, and where you see the gentleman at the cane, you hang a left, you'll find the Ben Ezra Synagogue, which, when I visited it for the first time, surprised me, first of all, because it's a late 19th century building. So the original building is no longer there. The synagogue was completely rebuilt on the same site in the 1890s, but on the same footprint as the old building. So we have a pretty good sense of what the size was originally. And it's actually a very small space. It doesn't really show it from the volume because it's also very tall, even taller than it needs to be. What you're seeing in the mezzanine is the Ezrat Nashim, the women's section, And the Geniza chamber was behind the original women's section, accessible by a kind of hole in the wall. So it's a very tall volume. But in fact, the number of people you could fit inside is so small that I had to kind of revise my notions of how many Jews actually went to synagogue in the 11th century when I saw the building. This is a sort of overview of what happened at the Islamic Conquests. So when the Muslims began conquering territory outside of the Arabian Peninsula, things went very quickly. And what it meant for Jews in particular is that communities of Jews who had lived under separate polities for a very, very long time, particularly in Sasanian Iran and in Roman Palestine and Egypt, were now living under the same empire and eventually speaking the same language. So the transformative effect on the Jewish world was not only profound, it was also very far-reaching in the sense that medieval Judaism really became what it was under Islamic rule. The Genizah is now scattered across 60 different collections and libraries to the point where a single piece of paper can literally be separated by an ocean. So the top half of this particular text is at the Jewish Theological Seminary in New York, the Geniza collection of which is the second largest in the world. They have 40,000 fragments. Currently, by the way, on vacation at Princeton because the JTS library is under renovation for 4 years. So we made an arrangement. Unfortunately, we have to return them all. And the bottom half of this is at the Bodleian Library in Oxford, which has a smaller collection of about 12,500 Geniza manuscripts, but it's a very, very dense and hand-picked collection, so a very important one for its size. The contents of the Geniza date mainly to the period between about 950 and 1250. There's actually quite a bit that postdates 1250, and it's just beginning to get the attention that it deserves now. People were depositing manuscripts and even some printed works into the Geniza literally up until the year it was finally emptied in 1897. The grand total, we think, because nobody's actually sat and counted, that'd be very painful, is 400,000 pages or fragments of pages. And they're far from all cataloged. The only reason that we have a kind of reasonable estimate of the count is that in the last 15 years, they've been digitized. The range is enormous, the range of material. About 90% of what's in the Geniza, and again, these are estimates, ask me in 5 years, I might tell you something completely different. But right now it seems that about 90% of what was in the Geniza were texts meant for posterity. So I'm putting books in quotation marks because the book in the Middle Ages was something a little bit different from what we think of today. There were different formats of book, and they were used for different purposes. So there was the Codex, which is the book as we know it, a book with covers and a spine, and you turn the pages and there's text on both sides of the page. So when we read a book that isn't, say, a PDF, we're reading a Codex. Even, Kindle does a kind of rough approximation of the Codex, but the PDF is back to what's technically called the rotulus, which is a long vertical scroll. I'll get to that. So the Codex of all of these different book formats was new. It was the newcomer. Especially to Jews. The Codex replaced the scroll over a very, very long period, the first few centuries of the Common Era. And the main proponents, the people who really were responsible for the Codex's diffusion as a new book technology, were the early Christians. The Codex is a very convenient format if, let's say, you're a part of a persecuted religion that has a lot of important books and you want a compact way of storing written information. The Codex will store information in a much more compact way than the scroll will. Scrolls you've all seen because you've been to synagogues. So the scroll is technically a horizontal scroll where the text is written parallel to the long side but in columns. And this is the typical form of the book in antiquity. So most classical literature circulated in this form, and when the Christians came along and adopted the Codex, a couple of things happened. One is that they weren't the only ones who did it. There are also quote-unquote pagan texts, Greco-Roman classics that are preserved on codices. But it was really the Christians who adopted it with such enthusiasm that the Jews said, no way are we using the Codex, because we're not like them. And it wasn't, in fact, until the Muslims came along in the 7th century. And so here are the Muslims, like newcomers to the Middle East, the youngest Abrahamic religion. They're a little bit nervous about their legitimacy. And they see that there are all these Christian codices, and they say, well, our sacred scripture, what are we going to transmit this on in written form? Well, let's make it look like a sacred scripture. Let's put it in a codex form, because Christians were by far in the majority compared to Jews and Muslims. It was at that point that the Jews looked again at the Codex and they said, okay, the Muslims are doing it, we'll do it, it's fine. So the first Jewish codices that we know about, and we only know about them from secondhand mentions, are from the 8th or the 9th century. And the earliest Jewish codex that survived is actually on papyrus, so a very ancient writing material, and it's from the mid-9th century, as far as anyone can tell. So the Codex was one form of the Jewish book, but there were others. There was what's called a quire, which is simply a section of a codex, so a freestanding, basically, pamphlet. And that's actually a much more common book technology in the period that I study for one reason, which is that a lot of the books that were preserved in the Geniza were user copied. So if you wanted to read something, you needed a copy of it. And if you wanted a copy of it, sometimes you had to copy it yourself. Certainly less expensive than paying somebody to do it. So you find many of these books that are written in clearly non-professional, non-scribal handwriting. This is Arabic, by the way. If you thought it was Hebrew, don't worry, you're not going crazy. And this was actually written by a government official in the late 11th century. And he was certainly not writing it in such a way that anyone else would necessarily be able to read it if they didn't already know what it said. Arabic uses a lot of dots, kind of as a matter of course. They're not vowels. They actually distinguish consonants from each other. There are no dots in this manuscript. So there are certain letter shapes that could be one of 5 different things. You kind of have to know what you're reading to be able to read something like this. This is another example of a quire. This is a much more scribal, beautifully written quire, but you can see that this was once part of a larger codex. And here's the scroll that I showed you. So the scroll by the Middle Ages was used primarily for liturgical purposes, not just Torah scrolls, but also other sorts of scrolls, but it was basically already considered a kind of outmoded ceremonial technology. And then finally we have the rotulus. So the rotulus, which is our PDF, is a long vertical scroll where the text is written parallel to the short side of the page. And that is a very special book form because it appears to have been used for certain purposes. And the purposes for which it was used were oral, meaning if you were, let's say, reciting a piyut in synagogue, which people did a lot and often new piyutim, so liturgical poems that were written kind of on spec for particular occasions, the typical form on which you write one would be the long vertical scroll because it really wasn't meant for posterity. It was something that was meant as your kind of crib notes for essentially an oral performance. So there was a special kind of textual form, container, that was used for oral performances, and that's the rotulus. And I emphasize this because it used to be thought that the rotulus was a kind of intermediate form between the scroll and the codex, right? So the scroll is the horizontal one. But it turns out that from the Geniza we know that scrolls, rotuli, and codices were all used simultaneously. They were just used for different purposes. So what's the other 10%? The other 10% are documents, and this is what I've spent my career working on. And when I say documents, I mean things that weren't meant for posterity. Texts of rarely more than 1 page, which is nice if you are like me and you don't like to read texts that are more than 1 page long. The thing about reading texts that are only 1 page long is that if it's hard to read, soon the pain will end. The thing that's bad about reading texts that are only 1 page long is that you don't have that much information about how the scribe writes. So it's really kind of 6 of one, half a dozen of the other. So legal documents, letters, accounts, lists, any kind of ephemera that simply wasn't meant to be retained or that would get retained for maybe a generation in somebody's personal archive, those were all preserved, and that is some of the best historical material you can find in the sense that you have texts being written by people who weren't expecting them to be read. So just to give you a couple of examples, this is a legal contract. In fact, it's a marriage contract. It was written in Jerusalem in 1028, and you can immediately tell that it's a contract because you can see that at the bottom there are lots of signatures. These guys are actually pretty good scribes, I have to say. This is a pretty educated crowd witnessing this marriage, and they write in kind of nice scribal-looking Hebrew script. That's certainly not always the case with the Geniza, and in a way we get even better information out of the people with the worse handwriting. One of the things that the Geniza informed us that we had no idea was true before was that there was a burgeoning trade with the western coast of India, the Malabar coast, starting in the late 11th century. There were traders who were based in Fustat, Cairo, who had networks all over the western Indian Ocean, including the city of Aden, all over the Persian Gulf, and then into Gujarat and down into the Malabar coast. There are about 600 letters and other documents that have been preserved from the Indian Ocean trade in this period. And I'm teaching a graduate seminar on this subject now. It's the first time I've really made my way into this particular subset of material, and it's totally blowing my mind. Last week I learned that in the 12th century there was a Jew in Sumatra who wrote to a rabbi in the Malabar coast of India asking for a legal opinion in the 12th century. And what's amazing about it, it's not just a Jewish history thing, like, wow, there are Jews in crazy places, but also in terms of the general history of the Indian Ocean, nobody really understood the extent to which there was a global India trade before the Portuguese came in the early modern period. So this is something that's going to rewrite the history of the Indian Ocean. This particular letter I like for a lot of reasons, but there's one line that I wanted. First of all, it's very long, as you can see. This is a kind of like impressively long rotulus, mainly because the guy who was writing it was very important. He was a trader in Aden, and he was kind of the linchpin of the India trade. So he had lots of connections in Egypt and lots of connections in India. And he didn't just trade with Jews, even though he was Jewish. He was a Persian Jew. He traded with everyone. So he writes to an associate of his on the Malabar coast in the 1130s, and he's explaining to him that he sent him some stuff. I'm going to zero in on this passage. You can actually see the word filfil in Judeo-Arabic, which is pepper. He says, I noted that you mentioned in your esteemed letter that you had sent 12 bahars of pepper in the ship of the Nakhuda Ramisht. I'll explain what this all means. They arrived. So a lot of these letters are like, I got your letter, but I didn't get the other letter that you said you sent. Like, they spend a few lines talking about what they sent and did you get what I sent, because they never know if things are going to arrive. And sometimes they even send 2 identical letters just to be sure. So how much is 12 bahars of pepper? So the calculus, I mean, I was looking at this in a footnote. I was like, that can't be right. 3,600 pounds of pepper. So pepper was in fact native to the Malabar coast, and this is really one of the main commodities that's getting traded in the India trade. And as you can see, the idea is if you're going to go all the way there, you should bring back a lot. So who is this captain or this ship owner? So first of all, the word Nakhuda is from Persian, so that shows you kind of what the lingua franca of the Indian Ocean trade was. It means captain or ship owner. And the etymology is there's the Persian word nava, which means sea, like naval or navy or nautical, right? Persian is an Indo-European language, so you can hear that in there. And then khoda means owner. So this is somebody who owns a ship. And Ramisht is his name. And it turns out that we actually have quite a bit of information about him, and we have information about him not only from within the Geniza, but also from outside. So he was from the island of Siraf, just off of the coast of what today is Iran, so kind of perfectly situated to become a ship's captain. I sort of think of him as like the Aristotle Onassis of his day. And there's information outside the Geniza to the effect that he had a trading agent, a certain Ali al-Nili, who brought back from China, from Canton, in a single voyage, merchandise worth 500,000 dinars. So in today's money, this is something like $500 million to $1 billion. 2 dinars could support a working family for a month, just to kind of give you a sense of scale. This is another one of those things where I had to make sure, like, are all these zeros really correct? There are some inscriptions that refer to this ship's captain. In 1135, he founded a hospice on the Arabian Peninsula, and the inscription, the founding stone, still exists. There's textual information to the effect that he provided a large piece of Chinese silk to cover the Kaaba in Mecca, so he was a pretty important guy. And his tombstone has actually survived in the Arabian Peninsula as well. He died in 1140. So this is the ship's captain with whom our friend Madmoun ibn al-Hassan in Aden is sending his peppercorns. Even this guy, Madmoun, turns out to be important because his tombstone has actually survived in Yemen, amazingly enough, and it's inscribed in Hebrew. So it's inscribed with the date. We actually know when he died. It has his patronymic. It has his Ibn Bandar, which is his nisba, special kind of name that you have depending on where you come from or which family you come from in Arabic. So there's very little doubt that this is in fact his tombstone. The point, there's a whole teeming world of people who we had never heard of until the discovery of the Geniza, who turned out to be insanely important in their time period. And so, it behooves us to learn about them. On the other hand, there are also lots of letters in the Geniza from people who we had heard of before the discovery of the Geniza. So here's one. This is Sharir Gaon. He was the head of the yeshiva of Pumbedita, which by that time was in Baghdad, in Iraq, and he writes this letter around 970. I had a professor in graduate school, taught at the Jewish Theological Seminary, named Neil Danzig, who used to say, the letters of the Gaonim, they're basically schnorbriefen. So if you've ever done any Jewish fundraising, you can say that you have a very long pedigree. Several years have elapsed since you sent us questions and donations, but we have not forgotten you as you appear to have forgotten us and the yeshiva. So a real example of guilt tripping 1,000 years ago. And many of them are like this. But there's actually, it's a kind of interesting dynamic because what the Gaonim are doing is they're saying, please don't stop sending us questions, because by you sending us questions, this is how we can kind of be connected with you. And if you go through the literature of the Gaonim and the kinds of legal questions they were answering, very few of them are actually practical questions. There are quite a few questions to the effect of, how do you read this passage in the Talmud, something that doesn't actually matter for daily life. So you get the sense that the Gaonim are as dependent on the Jewish diaspora as the diaspora is on them. Maimonides. So Moses Maimonides, the famous philosopher, physician, and courtier to the Ayyubid dynasty, who were just after the Fatimids. He was born in Cordoba, in the Iberian Peninsula, in 1138, and by the 1160s he had moved to Fustat, and the synagogue that he went to was the same synagogue that preserved the Geniza, which is another stroke of great good fortune, because it means that many of his drafts of works like the Guide to the Perplexed or the Mishnah Torah are in fact found in the Cairo Geniza. So we know what his handwriting looks like, and that's also a very good thing, because it means that when we look at something like this, which is a little throwaway note, we actually know that he was the one who wrote it. This is a note that he wrote to we don't know who, saying, "May the respected sheikh," which just means elder. By the way, the stuff that's in Roman type is in Hebrew, the rest is in Judeo-Arabic, so Arabic and Hebrew characters. "May the respected sheikh, may God preserve him, come in so that a meeting can be convened with him on Saturday." I did not translate this Shabbat because he says Yom HaSibt, which in Arabic is just Saturday. "In the presence of the elders who will decide what is to be done, may your welfare increase." I get the sense that this guy's kind of in for it. And then he says, "As for your note, it arrived completely wet, impossible to read, i.e. your email got stuck in my spam filter." And then in the margin he says, "It is especially important that you not be late. Peace." So who knows what this is really about, but we can kind of see a portrait of Maimonides, the everyday administrator in here. This is actually, I wanted to show you this letter by Shmuel ben Chofni. He's another Gaon from Iraq, but from the other yeshiva, the yeshiva of Sura. He's writing to somebody who we don't know who it is. And there's something really interesting going on. So it's basically another schnorr brief. "Please thank on my behalf David ben Babshad, who's a Persian Jew, probably a Karaite. May God support him, since he has extended toward me every kindness, benefited me, and been loyal to me. Let him know of the esteem in which I hold his loyalty." And he goes on to talk about if everybody raised funds for the yeshiva like him, we'd be in great shape. But interestingly enough, so you can't mention somebody in a Geniza letter without immediately saying a blessing after their name, right? That's just like, it's bad etiquette not to do that, and if you really like hate somebody's guts, you still bless them, but you say, may God destroy them, or something like that. So in this case, the blessing of choice, in the business we call them sliding blessings, because you kind of slide them in after the person's name, is may God support him. In Arabic, it's ayadahullah, and the Gaon is writing in Judeo-Arabic, but when he writes the blessing on people's names, he switches to Arabic script. And I have to say that I had read this letter many times before I figured out what was going on, because my eyes simply did not want to believe that that was what was happening. But indeed, it's what's happening. He clearly had some kind of letter writing training in Arabic script, and so this is just kind of the natural way it flowed out of his pen, the sliding blessings in Arabic script. This is a grocery list, quite literally. Chard, coriander, leeks, good olive oil, saffron, firewood, cheese, fresh fava beans, a basket from the mill, and wait for it, a fat hen. Another one of those things that I couldn't believe my eyes, and I had to ask at least 3 people on Facebook to confirm it for me. So I'm just going to kind of skip over some of these examples. I have some friends, we like to collect doodles from the Geniza. Every once in a while you find something truly interesting, like a man hunting on horseback carrying a spear. Not really sure what's going on there, whether that's really a dog in front of him or a dragon or who knows what. This is kind of wonderful. This is some kind of a galley. I showed this actually to a couple of colleagues of mine who are experts in medieval nautical technology, and they told me what I already knew, which is that it's a ship with oars. So we don't really know what kind of a ship this is, but there does seem to be some kind of a flag on it with a 6-pointed star, which may or may not be meant as a Jewish symbol. And these are amulets. So this was somebody who was writing amulets, probably against scorpions, to judge by the little drawing of the scorpion. But if you look at the large sheet, they were actually writing multiples. The idea was you kind of tear one off and sell it to somebody as an amulet. And so you can see that they've sold 3 of them, and the rest of the sheet still remains. So the story of the discovery of the Geniza is complex and also kind of thrilling, because it was happening precisely in the same era as Egyptomania and the discovery of pharaonic Egypt. And the fact that anyone was going to Egypt at all not interested in pharaonic material is extraordinary. And there was a whole cast of characters. So the book to read on that is called Sacred Trash by Adina Hoffman and Peter Cole. There are actually several books on the discovery of, but what Hoffman and Cole did is they went into the archives of the actual collectors, in some cases literally going up to the attics of their descendants and pulling out letters that had never been read before, and trying to kind of give a responsible, scholarly, historical sense of what was going on in the late 19th century. So they did a fantastic job of it. One of the claims that Hoffman and Cole make in this book is that the Geniza is actually more important than the Dead Sea Scrolls. I'm not sure I would put it that way. I would say maybe it's differently important from the Dead Sea Scrolls, but there is one very important difference, which is that the Dead Sea Scrolls primarily preserved texts that we already knew. So biblical texts, and then with some exceptions, there are some texts we'd never seen before, there are a few letters, but the vast majority are texts that we knew the text of, we knew that they were part of the Jewish canon. But the Dead Sea Scrolls became enormously important after the discovery in 1947 because of the Jewish-Christian schism. People wanted to understand what was going on in early Judaism at the time of Christianity. But in fact, there's actually very little new information there of the historical variety. For every marriage contract found at Qumran, there are thousands from the Geniza. And marriage contracts can be an absolutely fascinating source of information. My colleague at Princeton, Eve Krakowski, wrote a book just published last year on adolescent girls in Jewish law as reflected in the Geniza, but she went much further than that. One of the things that she figured out is that the divorce rate was between 40 and 50%. And that it was a tiny percentage of Jewish children who in fact grew up in a single household with a stable set of adults, because you'd go and you'd live with the aunties for a while, you'd go to the grandparents and so forth. And if you think about the implications of that kind of mobility, even just within the same city, for the transmission of Jewish tradition, it's fascinating. It's not as though you're born into a family that practices the Babylonian rite and all you ever see is the Babylonian rite. There's quite a bit of switching around. Not only was the discovery of the Geniza fortunate for Jewish history, it was also fortunate for Middle Eastern history. So when I talked earlier about how the Ottomans have these huge archives, it's long been the lament in the field of Middle Eastern history that there are no medieval archives. So Fustat happened to be right smack in the middle of the Islamic world. And due to a series of developments that nobody in the Geniza world really had that much to do with, what happened was that the Abbasids, who had been ruling over the Islamic world since 750, their empire started to weaken around 900, and an upstart dynasty from central North Africa called the Fatimids, who were Shiites, took advantage of the weakness of the Abbasids, and they essentially took over most of North Africa, all of Egypt, and up into Syria, coming right up to the gates of Baghdad itself, although they never actually conquered Iraq. Over the course of the 3rd and 4th Islamic centuries, the geography of the Islamic world shifted completely. We actually have some eyewitness accounts of people who were aware that something very momentous was happening. So there is, these are the walls of Cairo, by the way, because the Fatimids were the ones who founded Cairo. It was their Palatine complex, and they called it the City Victorious, which in Arabic is Al-Medina al-Qahira. Qahira means victorious, so that's anglicized as Cairo. Strategically located right at the nexus of the Mediterranean trade and the Indian Ocean trade. So what that meant is that Cairo quickly became the economic center, the economic powerhouse of the Islamic world. Population-wise, the only real rival to Cairo at the time was probably in China and possibly Cordoba, depending on whose population statistics you believe, but historical demographics are complex. We're talking somewhere in the ballpark of like 300,000 to 400,000 people, which is enormous by medieval standards. So people were aware that something very big was happening. There's a geographer named Al-Maqdisi who was a product of this wave of east-west migration because one of his grandparents had come from Iran, and he himself had been born in Syria. When it comes time to talk about Egypt, even though he's not from Egypt, he says, Baghdad has been superseded until the day of judgment. Egypt's metropole has now become the greatest glory of the Muslims. So even as early as the 10th century, people realized something very, very big had changed. So that is part of what makes the Geniza such a fortunate find for Middle Eastern history, because it's precisely there, at precisely that time, that important things are going on. And as you've seen from just what I've shown you so far, there are many Arabic script documents that were preserved in the Geniza, which is not something anyone expected. Theoretically, a Geniza exists in order to protect anything in Hebrew script, specifically anything carrying the name of God in Hebrew, from casual destruction. But in fact, in this Geniza, there was pretty much every alphabet you can possibly think of. There was Arabic, there was Greek, there was some Latin script. Primarily it was Hebrew script, but not entirely. There are two theories about that. One theory is that people just discarded what they had into the Geniza without really going through it and kind of sorting things out. The other theory, which is what I'm sort of becoming more convinced is the case, is the custom of depositing texts into a kind of limbo for eternity to spare them casual destruction was not just a Jewish custom. There are two, I think it would be a stretch to call them Genizot, but there are two caches of manuscripts exactly parallel to the Geniza, one from Damascus and one from Sana'a in Yemen, that were kept interred between the walls of, in one case between the ceiling and the roof of a building, in another case in a kind of separate chamber, and just kind of left there for posterity and discovered right around the same time in the 1890s. So there were non-Jewish Genizot, and it's possible that this was simply a region-wide custom. It's possible from the Geniza to actually see how people were using texts, which is a completely fascinating development. This slide is definitely out of place, but we'll get back to it later. I'll talk about Saladin in a second. So it's possible from the Geniza to see how people were actually using texts. not just kind of what they were reading, but also how they were reading them. You have marginal notes, you have reuses, sometimes you have 2-3 texts on a single page that don't appear to have to do with each other, but in fact it was one person who had them all to hand. So it shows you people's reading habits in a very kind of intimate way. Not only can you see the way people were reading, you can also see the rate of deposit in many cases, which means that the Genizah is actually giving you slightly more information than you would get from a continuously existing archive or library. So everything that I just said to you about kind of 3 texts on a single page or being able to see what people were really doing with manuscripts, all of this is part of a new kind of wave of study of the Genizah, which is awareness of the material text, awareness of the physicality of these manuscripts and their afterlives, not just who wrote them, but also who read them, who owned them, who threw them away, when, whether the paper was recycled, that kind of thing. And part of the reason that we're able to even say any of this about the physicality of these manuscripts is because of digitization. The last decade has seen enormous progress in the conservation and description and photography of all the Genizah materials. So you can now actually access Genizah manuscripts from the comfort of your living room couch. I've gone on record as working in my pajamas. You no longer need to rely on the intermediary of the printed transcription or to get on an airplane to see manuscripts, and even better, you can compare manuscripts from different collections without running between Oxford and Cambridge. That's terrific, okay. So a lot of this is because of a project called the Friedberg Geniza Project, which aimed to do all of this digitization, and nearly the whole Geniza is kind of ingathered like exiles on this website, which you can register for. Anyone can go and play with it. And one of the really great things that the FGP, the Friedberg Geniza Project, has done is to develop computer vision technology in order to make it easier to find, remember those halves I was talking about of manuscripts that are on different continents? So there is computer vision technology embedded in the website that helps you to find what we in the business call joins. A join is 1 or 2 or more parts of the same manuscript. Finding a join, it's like not quite as amazing as finding a new particle in physics, but definitely champagne should be involved. So here's how this works. I was casually reading a piece of scholarship from the 1960s, and I noticed that the scholar cited a court case that looked very interesting to me. It had to do with a physician whose rabbi exiled him from the synagogue. And I thought, ooh, gossip. So the thing is, like, when it's 15th century, you don't have to call it gossip. And this physician became so annoyed that his rabbi had done this to him that he decided to take his case to an Islamic court, to a Qadi court. And he, in fact, got a decision from a Qadi saying, no, it's okay, he can go and pray wherever he wants. I'm not really sure whether the rabbi listened, but in any case, there was now a state mandate to let the physician back into the synagogue. The only problem was that only half of the document had actually been preserved, and I really wanted to see the other half. And I'd known about this for a little while, and when the join finding technology came onto the FGP, I had an unbelievable case of beginner's luck. So I put the shelf mark, CUL stands for Cambridge University Library, Taylor, Schechter, Arabic, 38131. I put the shelf mark in, I hit join suggestions, and you can see there are 3 tabs there because there are 3 different algorithms that govern the finding of joins. And effectively what the computer is doing is, it's not looking at language, it's not looking at whether it's paper or parchment, it's not looking at any of the things that you or I as human beings would look at. It's doing a very computery thing, which is it's essentially facial recognition software, where it's kind of making a map of the ink on the page and using things like text density and things that the human eye doesn't necessarily perceive or think about or process in order to find join candidates. So it won't find you one join, it will find you kind of 300 candidates, and you have to go through them all, and so it still requires human labor, but at least you're going through 300 instead of 400,000. And so lo and behold, I hit the second tab, and I found this, and this turned out to be the second half of the document. And I have to say, I have not had that kind of luck since, although I have also had some good luck with the join finder. But this was really like an unbelievable first try. And the great thing about it was that it actually had the date of this event on it. So this happened in 1463. I have a colleague in Israel at Bar-Ilan University who works on the late Geniza, so 15th century for him is like early. And I told him about this, and it turns out that he actually has the Jewish court record of the same case. So I said, you take this, because I tried to read it and I couldn't read every word, so I'm happy to give it over to you. And he's just finished the article on it. So I want to just add that I'm not a techno-messianist. I don't actually think that the digitization of medieval manuscripts in and of itself has the capacity to solve problems of historical research. Like any technology, it totally depends on what people do with it. But one thing that people are doing with the digitized Geniza fragments is paying closer attention to the material aspects of the text, with very good consequences for our ability to take the information that has survived and make much more of it than we did before. So back in the day, and this is certainly how I was trained, you would kind of go into the text and pull out the verbal information, and that was it. And then you would kind of like leave the bones on the floor of the butcher shop. A friend of mine calls this deboning a manuscript, where you just pull out the textual information, you forget about the rest. But that is actually much more rare as a method of scholarship today, precisely because people have access to the images from their pajamas. So I wanted to share with you one case study that kind of brings all of the threads that I've brought out here together. The fact that there's Arabic in the Geniza, the fact that the Geniza has the capacity to solve some problems of what we thought was a dearth of archives in the pre-Ottoman Middle East, the fact that, that many of these texts are fragmentary. So this is a spectacular join. You can see that it's about 7 different pieces. It's from 3 libraries on 2 continents. These manuscript fragments will never be in the same place at the same time ever again. And I didn't find this join. A friend of mine named Ronnie Schweka found it, and he found it because he wasn't actually looking for the Arabic text. He was looking for the Hebrew text, Hebrew and Aramaic text on the verso. So he found this join artisanally. He didn't actually find it using the join finding software. What he wanted to do was go into Geniza fragments and find every instance he could of a particular text from the 8th century called the She'iltot. So this is a Gaonic text. It's legal homilies. It was composed in Iraq around 750. And a teacher of him had said, don't bother looking for the She'iltot in the Geniza because it's a closed case. You're not going to find it. There are 2 manuscripts of it that survived. They both survived in Europe. Forget about it. So Ronnie, like a good scholar, didn't listen to his teacher and went into the Geniza and found 120 fragments of the She'iltot. So it turns out that the congregations in Egypt were very interested in this Iraqi work. And of these 120 fragments, he was able to piece together these 7. We were working in Oxford at the time, both of us on a fellowship devoted to the material text of Geniza fragments, and he knew that I was interested in Arabic script fragments. So he emailed me from across the library and he said, hey, I have something for you. And what he sent me was about a meter of a decree from the Fatimid Chancery concerning a dispute over irrigation canals, the kind of document that had the archive of the Fatimid Caliphate survived, we might have already known about, except that we never saw anything like it. As you can see, this decree, the Arabic script, very wide line spacing. The same colleague who talks about deboning, he calls this the sovereign privilege of waste. The idea is like we're the caliphs, we can waste as much paper as we want to. So the question is, what are these 2 texts doing on the same rotulus? I just want to show you an example of another Fatimid decree. In other words, they're unmistakable. Nothing else looks like this. The wide line spacing, the calligraphic Arabic script, the boat-shaped lines that go gently downward and then markedly upward with word stacking at the ends of lines. This is a whole aesthetic of the chancery style of the 10th century that was new at the time, and I have written 300 pages about this because I found it so fascinating that if you compare this to Arabic documents from 100 years earlier, they look absolutely nothing like this. So the question is, what was going on that made this transformation happen? So I knew that I was looking at part of a Fatimid decree. What was interesting is that there were quite a few of these fragments in the Geniza that people had just kind of ignored. So the way that scholars will have tunnel vision, I'm interested in this part of a manuscript, I'm going to ignore the rest because otherwise the whole thing is going to be a giant rabbit hole. Many people had studied the Hebrew texts that were written between the lines of Fatimid decrees or on the backs of Fatimid decrees without asking themselves, okay, but what are these gigantic lines of Arabic doing here? And as I began to dig, I began to find more and more of these. So I thanked my colleague very much. I said I never possibly could have pieced this together myself because there was so much blank space, whereas you had the text density, so that's great. And I immediately realized that something very interesting was happening, which was this copy of the Sheiltot, number one, it's totally weird. If you compare it with the other manuscripts of the Sheiltot, there are passages that are out of order. There are things that are done in a way that's completely strange according to the other versions of the text. So somebody's messing around with the text. That's the first thing that's weird. The second thing that's weird is that we actually know who it was. The handwriting is the hand of a guy named Ephraim ben Shmaria. He falls into the category of people we'd never heard of before the Genizah was found. But he was the head of the synagogue where the Genizah was kept until he died in 1055. Okay, so why is that significant? If Ephraim ben Shmaria wrote on the back of this half, you can see these are just half lines of a Fatimid decree, and he died in 1055, and the Fatimid dynasty fell in 1171, then that means that what everyone had thought, which is, oh, there are no Fatimid archives because the next dynasty that came along destroyed their archive. No, in fact, lots of Fatimid documents were jettisoned from the archive before the dynasty fell. So as soon as I looked at this and sort of understood the whole manuscript, I realized this has the potential to unlock at least something about what archiving practices in the Middle East were like. And what I realized after thinking about it for a few years and talking to a lot of colleagues is that archives, so the difference between an archive and a Geniza is that a Geniza is for a kind of permanent limbo, and it's a one-way street. You put things in, you don't take them out. An archive is meant not just for storage, but also for retrieval. Things have to be organized. You have to be able to access them, otherwise there's no point. And if you want to keep them organized and keep what's in there accessible, you also have to prune. So the pruning process, the jettisoning process, is a normal part of the archiving process. And this was, in fact, a product of the pruning process. I'm going to skip these slides in the interest of time. So basically, these long vertical scrolls would go out all over the empire. They were the kind of impressive scrolls that were meant to be read aloud. Remember what I said about the rotulus and oral performance. So this was kind of one vehicle of oral performance, that you'd read a decree aloud. But once you'd read the decree aloud, there was no point in keeping the very long version of it, because in fact you could just write a compact copy and keep that in the archives. And in fact we have an example of an archival copy of a decree. This is much more sensible. You get the same amount of text into a much more compact space, you archive it, it's great. If you don't do that, you're going to end up with a very, very messy office. I know you all know what I'm talking about. So the story didn't quite end there, because the top fragment was in fact not one of the ones that Ronnie Schweka found. Ronnie and I and a third colleague of ours in Paris who was working on the rotulus as a book form, we decided that we would write a 6-handed article on this, and we published it online on the website of the Cambridge University Library. And about 18 months later, because things move glacially in academia, we got an email from a graduate student in Frankfurt saying, hey, I have something for you. And what she had found with the join finding software on FGP, which we had not done our homework because we hadn't put every single fragment into the join finding software, she found the top fragment. And the top fragment contained the smoking gun, because at the very top of this Sheiltot rotulus, in his kind of like not very perfect handwriting, we have Ephraim ben Shmaria saying, you can barely read it because the text is very faded, but it says Shabbat Bereshit. So this was a text that he wrote out in order to deliver as a sermon on the first Torah reading of the year. Probably the Palestinian synagogue, which this was, the Palestinian Rite Synagogue, was doing a triennial reading, so they weren't even getting through the whole Torah in a year. So this was the first of the 3-year cycle. So what does that mean? He's basically got this text of the Schechter. It doesn't make any sense according to the other texts of the Schechter, and now we know that it was for a specific occasion. Okay, so put yourself in the shoes of Ephraim ben Shmariah. You're the cantor of this congregation. Cantors had to write poetry. They also had to deliver sermons. You're like Bach in Leipzig. Like you have decided you're going to produce a new cantata, right, for every Sunday church service, and it's a lot of work. And you're going crazy because you're like, God, what am I going to do this Shabbat? So you pull a book off the shelf. It happens to be the Schechter, and you say, oh, there's really good material in here. So you take a passage from here, you take a passage from there, what we would call plagiarism, but which in the Middle Ages was simply scholarship. So the implications of this are, first of all, note that it's a rotulus. So this is Ephraim ben Shmariah with a one-off, right? This is a text of the Schechter that's not actually meant for posterity, even though it's a book. It's meant for oral delivery. And what that means is that if you're Ronnie Shweka and you're like, I want to understand the history of the text of the Schechter, I want to figure out how it's being transmitted in all these different places in the Jewish world in the Middle Ages, you got to throw this text out. And the reason you have to throw this text out is that it's not actually a proper version of the text. It's a performance. It's a one-off. It's like, to take an extreme example, Pete Townshend's guitar after the Who concert, right? Like it gets essentially destroyed after the thing itself. And as you can see, it was eventually torn into pieces. So that's the kind of information that people are now starting to pull out of Genizah fragments by looking at their physical form. Okay, the last thing I want to talk about is how you can get involved in Genizah research. There is an online project called the Zooniverse, which is, they bill themselves as a citizen science forum, meaning serious research projects. For example, looking at photographs and finding baby galaxies, or looking at photographs of every single square inch of field in Ireland and finding the pollinators to help people do bee research. Lots of scientific research that requires an enormous amount of human labor, but not very specialized labor, but labor that's kind of fun if you're somebody who's interested in science projects, or if you want to look at a lot of cool pictures of the galaxy, or of pollinators, or of medieval manuscripts. So some colleagues of mine at Penn and at Tel Aviv University and at Haifa University, we all decided to go in for a Zooniverse project, and our project got chosen, which was wonderful. Here are some examples of the Zooniverse projects that you can see. You can see they're mostly biologists and astronomers, interestingly enough, but there are some manuscript projects, and ours is one of them. It's called Scribes of the Cairo Geniza, and we've organized it in two phases. So phase one, it's like if you play Sudoku, you should just do this. So far we've had 4,000 volunteers classify more than 200,000 pages of manuscript, and this has been going on for a couple of years now. And the beauty of it is that you don't actually need language expertise or any specialized knowledge, because the website will actually give you field guides. So like, you don't know the difference between like a thrush and a robin, that's fine, we're gonna give you the field guide, you can recognize the shapes. So you don't know the difference between like a Hebrew book and an Arabic document, doesn't matter, we're gonna give you the shapes right here, just tell us what you see. So once you log in, and anyone can do this, it's going to give you pretty much at random a manuscript. And the first thing you have to do is you have to tell them what language this is in. So can you actually see this far, what script this is? So this is in Hebrew script, so you pick Hebrew, and then you hit next. And then it asks you more questions. Is the Hebrew script written in a formal or an informal style? Okay, so what does that mean? Are the lines straight? Is it a scribal hand? Is it a text basically that was meant for posterity or not meant for posterity? This is our way of asking non-experts, is it a book or is it a document? Because that's really what we want to know. We want to sort the texts out into two piles, literary, documentary. So I looked at this and I said, well, I can tell that it's kind of a book, so I'm going to say it's a formal hand. And I was like, well, I'm not really sure. I guess I should look at it and really see, and then I looked more closely and I realized those rows are really straight. They're not necessarily like horizontally straight, but they're very regular. So I'm going to call this a formal hand. So I picked formal, moved on, and then it says, is there evidence of binding? So you tell me, evidence of binding? Yes. Absolutely. So I hit evidence of binding. Are there justified margins? Definitely. Is there wear at the corners of the pages? Yes, so these are all sure signs that this was once part of a codex. So great, now we know that we're going to put this in the literary pile, and move on. Then they want to know some details, like are there diagonal or perpendicular lines of text in the margin? That might seem like a weird question, but in fact, for us, it's a, what do they call it in medicine? A differential diagnosis. That the only kinds of documents in the Genizah that you have diagonal text in the margins from are letters. So we want to know what is a letter. The kind of convention of writing a letter was you'd leave a nice right-hand margin and then you'd fill it afterwards with what a teacher of mine used to call angle parking, because you can fit more cars in that way, diagonal text. So no diagonal text here. Are there diacritical points? In fact, there are a couple of funny little, these are 3 dots to mark the end of a line. You have 2 dots over letters right here, which is actually Babylonian vocalization, which at this point was completely outmoded, but sometimes if scholars wanted to look really fancy, they would use Babylonian vocalization instead of Tiberian vocalization for Hebrew. So all of this suggests literary manuscript, so I've hit all the buttons and it's going to be classified as literary. So then you hit done and then it gives you another fragment. And you can just keep doing this till the cows come home, pretty much. Very, very fun stuff. That's phase 1. So what happens when we have our piles of literary and documentary? Then phase 2 begins. And it's propitious because phase 2 is set to begin on March 5th, which is Tuesday. So you can still participate in phase 1 even after phase 2 begins, but just to show you how phase 2 works. I mentioned the field guide. So this is the field guide. Arabic and Hebrew, I'm not really sure what the difference is. Let me take a look. Oh, okay, that's the difference between Arabic and Hebrew. Or dots, diacritics, vowels, what are they even talking about? And then it shows you examples. So these are the field guides if you're not feeling too confident. Hello, slides. Okay, this does not seem to have appeared. In any case, the second stage of the Zooniverse project is going to be transcription. And that's where the magic is going to happen. And it's going to happen in a number of different ways. Remember formal script versus informal script? The formal script all got put into the pile of easy Hebrew and Arabic. And the informal script, which is like the sloppy ones not writing the dots, all got into the pile of difficult Hebrew and Arabic script. So you can pick whatever level you want. But the beauty of it is, so I always say when I'm transcribing a document that you can do 80% of the document in 20% of the time that you spend on it. But you're going to spend 80% of your time doing that last 20% that's going to drive you crazy. You're going to be on Facebook, you're going to be on Skype with all your colleagues, you're going to mobilize an international team, and there's always going to be that one word that you can't read. So how about instead of yourself mobilizing an international team, everybody just goes on the Zooniverse and decides okay, I'm going to do a word today. Because people always see different things and they see in different ways. So transcribing on Zooniverse, the idea is if we all kind of pitch in, then a lot more can happen in this field, i.e. you don't need a PhD to do it. So I was educated as a philologist, which means philologists are extremely ashamed if they make any linguistic errors. And that can be very inhibiting to scholarly research because you don't want to take risks. That's kind of like the old school is get every word or hang your head in shame. The new school, which I myself am a proponent of, is it takes a village, and it's a lot more fun with a village. So as you can probably tell, I'm a big believer in the democratization of research. I would like to spare future generations what I went through, which was being thrown into the deep end. If somebody had just kind of broken it all down for me step by step, oh, here's some easy manuscripts, okay, now here's some harder manuscripts, I think I would have been a much happier grad student and young scholar. What I was taught is, in fact, the one thing that really unites all philologists, whether they're studying Greek or Latin or Chinese or hieroglyphic or Hebrew or Arabic, which is this kind of debilitating fear of making errors. But if we're honest about how we work, of course we make mistakes all the time. We're human beings and we're reading things that are very, very old, written by people who are very different from we are. Perfectionism is a kind of game of gatekeeping. And it's much more important, I think, at this stage of research to throw the gates open. There are 400,000 texts in the Genizah, and we'll never get through all of them if we shut people out. As we speak, part of our Zooniverse team is in Israeli schools showing kids how to use the site so they can see what Hebrew script looked like 1,000 years ago, because really no two hands are alike. And our entire team on 3 continents was unanimously also in support of having an Arabic language interface so that people all over the Arab world, more than 200 million speakers of Arabic, could go and look at medieval Arabic manuscripts on the site. So when we go live with phase 2 on March 5th, that's what we'll have, and I hope you'll join us in the fun. Thank you. There's a lot of questions over here.
I can speak loudly.
Use the mic.
So, why were people throwing workday items in there? Like, I can understand our tradition now is the liturgical stuff would be put in the Geniza. But why these common tech, grocery lists? Why were they, do we know why?
Right. So there are a couple of going theories. One is that almost anything that you would write, you would begin with an invocation. So if you're writing in Arabic, you say Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. If you're writing in Hebrew, then you have an Aramaic invocation, Bishmach Rahmana, which is clearly calqued from the Arabic. So in that sense, almost every piece of writing in the Geniza really does have the name of God on it. But there are also plenty of pieces of writing that don't, because they're second pages or whatever it happens to be. So at some point, I was asking myself the same question, and I thought, if I were an anthropologist and I had the capacity to do field research in 12th century Cairo, which is I dream about this, and I decided to, go brush up on my medieval Judeo-Arabic, and I started just stopping random Jews on the street, and I said, hey, why do you put things in the Geniza? I suspect that I'd probably get as many answers as there are Jews. Some would be like, oh, only the name of God. Other would be like, I saw my grandfather throw everything in there, so I threw everything in there. Other people would be like, well, I'm Christian, but the magic of the other is always magicer, so I put my stuff in the Geniza too. In other words, I think we'd probably get as many answers as there were people.
I have a question about the procedures for running a Geniza. You showed us a door. It looked to be high up in the synagogue, and yet there's the picture of the scholar, sitting at at some tables with boxes of documents around him. What happened? Were things reverently laid to rest, or were they thrown into a hole in the wall and dropped 2 stories?
That's an excellent question. So things were thrown in, and they landed where they landed, and dropped where they dropped, and sat for hundreds of years, which raises the question of, well, how did they survive to begin with? So let me just back up 1 second. Before they're thrown in, the synagogue in the Middle Ages is more than just a synagogue. It's a community center, but it's also a court of law. And so the leaders of the community are going to be hanging around there. They're going to be writing legal documents. They're going to be the witnesses there signing legal documents, meaning a lot of what we see in the Geniza is what was happening in and around the synagogue. And that explains why there's so much literary material and also why there's so many legal documents, because it's kind of like a business office in a sense. That said, once things are done, they're done. There is a proper archive in the synagogue at the time, but they're jettisoning things from the archive all the time. There was one very, very good stroke of fortune. In addition to the fact that the Geniza was in such a great place, such a central place at such a central time. Has anyone been to Cairo? So anyone ever breathed the air in Cairo? You know what I'm talking about, right? It's not just the diesel, it's the dust. So the dust in Cairo, I always thought it was like sand blowing in from the desert, but no, it turns out that the dust is actually limestone dust, because there's a friable limestone massif that overlooks the city of Cairo on the eastern bank of the Nile. And basically just, for millennia, this thing has been blowing dust onto Cairo, so that buildings in Cairo look as old as the pyramids, even if they were built under Sadat, because everything has this kind of brown, dusty patina. So it turns out that limestone cliff, so limestone chemically, it's by definition 50% calcium carbonate, i.e. chalk. And I learned from a friend of mine who's a paper maker and a book conservator that one of the best things you can use to conserve paper, parchment, and ink is chalk. So this layer of limestone dust that was blowing in over the manuscripts for thousands of years turned out to be very, very good for its preservation. There may also have been limestone in the calcium carbonate in the water supply when the paper was being made to begin with. So that has something to do with its preservation, despite the fact that it was all in a giant pile. The photograph you're referring to, this one, which I had as a background photo, but I didn't actually discuss, this is an iconic photograph of Solomon Schechter in about 1898, once he had returned from Cairo after 9 months in the Geniza chamber, sorting through things, ruining his lungs. He actually complained about the dust constantly in letters to his wife that Adina Hoffman and Peter Cole put in Sacred Trash, and it's like a great read, the chapter on Schechter. But one of the things that Hoffman and Cole point out is that this picture was almost definitely posed. And the reason it was, staged, and the reason it's staged is, first of all, because it's the 1890s, so all photos are staged. But more than that, Schechter, when he was actually sorting through Geniza fragments, he's actually in a room in the Cambridge University Library here, would always wear a kind of 19th century version of a gas mask, they used to call it his nose bag, in order to protect him from the Geniza dust. And what's great about this photo is, first of all, you can see there are fragments absolutely everywhere. Second of all, if you go into the Cambridge collection, it's amazing how orderly it is, which is to say that Schechter, who spent about 5 years sorting fragments, actually managed to sort them into piles that make a lot of sense. So the biblical manuscripts are with biblical manuscripts, the Judeo-Arabic letters are with Judeo-Arabic letters. It's a very orderly collection, and it's all because of the work that Schechter did. But one of the things that Schechter did was about something like 100,000 of the 200,000 fragments that he brought home from Cambridge, he left in one of these crates marked rubbish. And if the photo weren't as dark as it is, you could actually see the words rubbish stamped on the crate. That crate sat in the attic, almost like a Geniza, of the Cambridge University Library until the 1950s. And in the 1950s, a researcher named S.D. Goitein was there for the 7th summer in a row working on Geniza fragments, and a librarian came over to him and said, "Professor Goitein, I see that you're working very hard on these Geniza fragments every summer. There's something I'd like to show you." And brought him up to the attic room where there was a wooden crate marked Alexandria, Liverpool, which was unpacked, or rather packed, not yet unpacked, Geniza fragments that Schechter had brought back. And that became the Taylor-Schechter Additional Series, which contains some of the best historical information that we have. So the moral of the story is Genizas within Genizas. One scholar's trash is another scholar's treasure. And that's just the way scholarship goes. Yes, back there.
I noticed when they were reading your resume, they mentioned the department was Near East. Colloquially today, I don't even think anyone seems to use that term. Everyone refers to the Middle East. I guess I'm just wondering, is there an attempt, or is there some goal eventually that there will be a Near East, Middle East, and Far East again, or what is the academic position on whether or not one should even use those terms?
Sorry, I'm just laughing my head off here. Yes, I'm one of the last generation of Orientalists. The Department of Near Eastern Studies at Princeton has simply always been called that since it was founded in the mid-20th century. And why don't we change the name? It beats me. We really should. But I've only been there 4 years, so it's not up to me yet. But no, there is no attempt to go back to the old British colonial division where you have the Near East and then the Middle East, and then there's India, which is the big prize. No one's actually thinking that way. Well, let me just add, in seriousness, I kind of like saying Near East because I like to think of the Islamic Middle East as being continuous with the ancient Near East, because there are quite a few continuities that scholars have not really been so conscious of, because there's this idea of the Islamic Conquests happened and then absolutely everything changed. There are actually a lot of sort of recrudescences of ancient Near Eastern and certainly late antique legal practices, social practices, economic practices, you name it, and to kind of have that artificial barrier between Islam and everything else actually distorts the historical record somewhat. So I have a certain nostalgic love for the whole Near East thing, but no, there is no politics intended.
My question has to do with dating, and when you were, I probably should have thought of this before, but you used the common era and stuff, and I think you had a document, maybe a marriage document or something, and it was dated. So how are things dated before this calendar?
Yeah, that's a great question. There are a lot of different dating systems that get used in these documents, and this is kind of one of the tricks of the trade that you have to learn, because they never really tell you which dating system they're using. You just have to kind of like, do all the calculations in your head. So one of the most common ones that you see in Jewish texts is, this is totally insane, but dating according to the Seleucid era, i.e. the year when the Seleucids conquered, or rather started to rule Mesopotamia, which happened to be October 1st, 312 BCE. So you see these dates that are like, 1585, and you actually have to subtract 312. So that's one common dating system. The dating system that we use for the Jewish year, right, which in Latin would be called Anno Mundi, so from the creation of the world, is actually very rare in medieval texts. A lot of the Jewish writers actually use the Islamic calendar, so the Hijri year, which begins in 622, but then you lose 3 years for every century because it's a lunar calendar, right? So the lunar year is 11 days shorter than the solar year. I mean, it's complicated, is my point. And there are many different calendrical systems. And what that kind of makes you realize is calendars are conventions, but they're conventions, generally speaking, that are set by political authorities. And when you have multiple legal systems operating in tandem, then you're going to have multiple calendars. I have a teacher who just passed away, Peter Ahn from Columbia, who was a Jesuit in the 1970s. He was a personal confessor to the Shah's sister in Iran. And he talked about how like you'd pull out your agenda in the 1970s in Iran, and you'd have like 4 different calendars there because you needed like the Western calendar, and you needed the Islamic calendar, you needed the Zoroastrian calendar. So it's the same thing in Egypt. When you're talking about agriculture, you use the Coptic calendar. When you're talking about taxation, you use a different calendar. When you're talking about Islam, et cetera, et cetera. And then people kind of mix and match. It's chaos, essentially. Yeah.
I was wondering if any of the documents had been subjected to some of the new chromatographic techniques to see what people were eating, what organisms they were exposed to, etc.
I feel like hugging you. This is exactly like where my mind is right now. So there was this, for those of you who haven't heard about this, there was a fantastic article in the New Yorker in December talking about some research that people are starting to do, literally pulling the microbes off of manuscripts. And one of the great cases was they went into Mikhail Bulgakov, the Russian novelist's drafts of The Master and Margarita. And they like read the, whatever organisms were on the page, and what they found is that they were completely covered with morphine, which like we already knew that Bulgakov was taking morphine, but this kind of like clinched the case of why The Master and Margarita is such a brilliant book. It explains everything, right? So, and they've actually apparently pulled, bubonic plague off of medieval European manuscripts. So as soon as I read this, like my mind started going crazy, and I actually wrote. There's one of those like machines that you can use to do that kind of thing at Princeton. So I actually wrote to the department, and I was like, "Can we do a project together, please?" And I think it's just a matter of time before we do it. But I really want to know what these guys were eating and what they were coughing up and stuff like that. And what you need manuscripts that haven't been terribly well conserved. But I know which collections had really good conservators and which collections had bad conservators, and I love the bad conservators because there are like wrinkles in the page that will preserve microbes. Yes?
I have just read Bertrand Lassatsky's book, Aphrodite and the Rabbis, but he has no citations. He mentions something from the Genizah called the Book of Mysteries. And also, he said that there was a manuscript in the Genizah that was addressed to Helios, the god Helios.
Oh, yeah.
So
what's going on there?
yeah.
I was at the library the other day with my undergraduates. I had 30 undergraduates looking at Genizah manuscripts for the first time, which is a great experience. I love to watch their faces. But there were 2 in particular. I put them all at different tables with different binders of Genizah material. And there were these 2 students who happened to get a binder entirely full of Quran manuscripts. So this was page after page after page of the Quran in Arabic script. And they said to me, "What's going on here?" And I was like, "What do you think?" And they said, "Were Muslims putting things in the Genizah?" And I said, "Possible. What's another option?" And they were like, "I have no idea." And I was like, "Come on, think. Like, what's another option?" They were like, I have no idea. I was like, Jews were actually reading the Quran. Like, it's true. We know for a fact. And one of the reasons that we know is that there are also Geniza fragments of the Quran in which it's the Quran written in Arabic, but in Hebrew script. So Hebreo-Arabic, right? Not, what did we call it? Arabo-Hebrew. There you go. Arabo-Hebrew rather than Judeo-Arabic, something like that. We have the opposite phenomenon as well, where you have the Hebrew Bible written for some weird reason that nobody's ever been able to explain in Arabic characters. So there's a lot of cross-contamination going on. People are reading ancient literature. People are reading literature that the rabbis declared non-canonical. They have a much, much wider palette of reading than we might imagine. And this is really like the point, right? When I talk about Eve Krakowski discovering the divorce rates and kids moving from house to house, we tend to think of medieval people as being kind of these perfect, pious individuals who were almost like, I don't know, Victorian or, 1950s families or something like that. But it was a totally wild period. And you can see some of the wildness coming out of the manuscripts. Is that a question? Yeah.
You mentioned the slide you were going to get back to about Saladin.
About Saladin, yeah. So the Saladin slide, that little illuminated manuscript, was misplaced when I was talking about Ephraim ben Shmariah having died in 1055 and the Fatimid dynasty having fallen actually after that, right? Which means that they were dumping manuscripts. It wasn't just the Ayyubids who came in and dumped them for them. It was a Saladin slide just because he was the first Ayyubid sultan. That's all. Yeah.
These are really basic questions. When the old synagogue was replaced by the new synagogue in the 19th century, would they just leave the Geniza wall as it was so that nothing would be disturbed? Obviously, they didn't pull everything out.
They did.
They did?
They did.
Okay, so what happened?
So this is actually a not very well understood part of the Geniza's history, and there is a book in the last stages of being written now by Rebecca Jefferson, where she's kind of going into yet more archives and trying to figure out what was going on in the synagogue and in the Geniza chamber from about 1860 until Schechter came in 1896. In other words, we know the Schechter story. Schechter took out everything that was left in the Geniza after other people had had their way with it, after the the synagogue had been rebuilt. But what happened before? So as far as we can tell, a couple of different things happened. One is that in the 1860s, the roof of the Geniza chamber started to decay and basically collapse. At a certain point in the 1880s, they realized, okay, we're going to have to rebuild the whole thing. The manuscripts are already exposed. So let's take them out of the building. And essentially what they did is they put them in the courtyard. And we know that they put them in the courtyard because we have the accounts of people who came to Cairo and actually saw this and realized that dealers were going crazy. Like self-appointed manuscript dealers were going into this material, and this is when all the stuff got sold off to the libraries that weren't Cambridge. So Cambridge really got the dregs after the dealers had gone in and said, ooh, this is a nice whole-looking text. Let me see if the Bodleian is interested or something like that.
I'm sorry, it was just sitting there for the taking.
It was sitting there, I mean, not for the taking in the sense that there was still a Jewish community there, but let's say for the negotiation. Yes.
3 questions, very quick. I first learned about this story some years ago, and one of the things that struck me, and you provided partial answers, were there other Genizahs of this sort? You mentioned Damascus and Yemen, but Jews were distributed all around Europe, the Near East, et cetera, et cetera. So that's the first question. If there are others, why didn't you mention them? If there are others, why don't we know about them today? The second is, has any attempt at artificial intelligence been applied to interpreting, instead of this crowdfunding or crowd research, to do the sort of thing you talked about there?
Mm-hmm.
I forget the third.
Okay, no problem. So to answer your first question first, the same question about whether there were other Jewish Genizot in the Middle East occurred to two researchers in the 1980s, one of whom was a teacher of mine, Mark Cohen, and the other one was Edita Stillman. And they said, well, there are a lot of Jews from a lot of Middle Eastern countries around, so why don't we go and interview them and figure out what the practice of Genizah was in their community. And they discovered a couple of interesting things. One is that the only other Genizot that we know about, and there are two exceptions, which I'll mention in a moment, but besides those, the only other Genizot that we know about are, they basically go back to the 18th century, but not much before. And in fact, a colleague of mine actually excavated a Genizah from Morocco a few summers ago that I think was mostly 19th century material. One of the things that they found out is that there aren't a whole lot of other Genizot, and the ones that we know about are modern. But the second thing they found out is kind of what I was saying before, which is that for every community had its own kind of different little riff, different interpretation of the practice of Genizah. So even if we had them, we don't necessarily know what we would find in them. So the two exceptions are, in Cairo itself, there were two other major caches of Jewish manuscripts that have to be mentioned. One is in the Karaite synagogue in Cairo. There was what the Karaites themselves called a Genizah, but probably wasn't a Genizah the way we think of Genizahs, because it had shelves. It had shelves, and it contained mainly codices. And those codices are now in St. Petersburg. They were brought there by a man named Avram Firkovich, who was a 19th century Russian Karaite who collected manuscripts from all over the Middle East. And he seems to be the one who got into the Karaite synagogue and pulled out the manuscripts in exchange for repairing the synagogue and refurbishing and so forth. The second is that the Jewish community of Cairo kept its own archive. So again, the difference being that an archive is a two-way street and a Genizah is a one-way street. And this archive contained documents that go back to the 11th century. So the question is, what happened to it? A guy named Richard Gottheil, who was a professor of Oriental Studies at Columbia in the early 1900s, son of a German Reform rabbi who'd grown up in England and then come to the United States, married an Ottoman Jew, Emma Leon, who was from Lebanon, and so he managed to travel all over the Middle East in the very late Ottoman period because of family connections, and he spent a lot of time in Cairo. And we know that he saw this archive because he published a few documents from it. And then it's lost sight of. In 1969, an Arabist at Oxford named Donald Richards went to Cairo and he found the archive. And he writes about where he found it. He found it in the offices of the Jewish community, right where you'd expect to find it, except that nobody had bothered to ask. But he wasn't able to, he was only interested in the documentary material, and there were Torah scrolls, there was every manner of possible manuscript material you can imagine. But he was interested in a very particular section of the material, took a few photographs and left. I had asked myself this question of where this material went, and I really had despaired of ever finding it until I gave a series of lectures in Cairo in April of 2017, and the president and the vice president of the Jewish community were there, and they're absolutely fabulous people. Magda Haroun is the president, and the vice president is Sami Ibrahim. They're childhood friends. They both come from communist families, which is that's how you roll if you're an upper middle class Jew in Egypt. They're very kind of have this morbid sense of humor about the fact that there are only 10 Jews left in Cairo, and they say, we're the only two who are still walking, and so they came up to me afterwards and they said, let's do a digitization project together. And I said, great, what do you got? And they said, well, we have the whole archive of the Jewish community. I said, what? You have the what? They were like, the whole archive of the Jewish community. I was like, you really? So it turns out that when Magda Haroun became the president of the Cairo Jewish community, she got the key to the famous room. It was not a Genizah, it was the archive. And she had never been allowed in that room. The former president of the Jewish community, a woman named Carmen Weinstein, had always said to her, no, you can't go in the room, nobody can go in the room. When Magda Haroun got the key, she understood why she couldn't go in the room, because when she went in the room, it was 2 rooms, and it was floor to ceiling with manuscript material, and it was not in any kind of proper storage condition. So she did what any proper upper middle class communist Egyptian would do who believes in the state. She donated them to the National Library of Egypt. So in fact, they are there in the archive. Now, it's a very controversial decision, which is to say that all of the Egyptian Jews in France stopped speaking to her, and they said, "You're crazy, how could you do such a thing?" Whereas in Egypt, this stuff is regarded with an enormous amount of reverence as part of Egyptian history, to the point where there are now conferences on the Geniza and on Jewish history. There's a Maimonides conference coming up in Cairo in June. So this is very much a part of the Egyptian heritage that Egyptians want to study and want to promote.
So I know you guys, and you'll keep on asking questions all night long, so this will be the last question.
Somebody hasn't asked one? If not, we got to repeat.
Okay, I'll ask.
Okay.
What does Geniza mean and what language is it?
Yes. So Genizah is Hebrew, and it's actually a verb, and it has to do with burial. What's interesting about the root is that it's from an ancient Near Eastern root. There's an Aramaic cognate that made its way into Persian and also Arabic that actually means treasure. So is it trash or is it treasure? You decide. Thank you.